All right, so the class is now recording. All right, perfect. So we'll go ahead and get started. So just a brief overview of how Airbnb works. So what I always like to explain to people is that Airbnb is actually a listing platform. It's similar to Zillow. Airbnb is really a platform built to list furnished rentals. The platform itself is a complete disruptor in the lodging industry. You know, we've always had short-term rentals, we've always had vacation rentals. Vrbo has been around forever, but what Airbnb has done differently is that Airbnb has brought short-term rentals to your neighborhood, to your metro area. Airbnb was actually started in San Francisco, and the founder of Airbnb started out renting out an air mattress in his living room. And that's where the name of the platform came from. It was originally Air Bed and Breakfast, which has, of course, been shortened to Airbnb. And I do see we have additional people joining here. I'm just admitting people into the room as they come here. For the people who have just joined, feel free to ask any questions in the chat. It's always a fun class when we get to answer your questions and really cater the class to you. So I'll just keep an eye on those, and don't hesitate to ask the questions as we go through. So on the Airbnb platform, you can really list anything that you want. You can list an entire home, you can list a condo, an apartment, and you can list like guest houses, you can list rooms in your house. And the real flexibility is you can also list on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize about Airbnb is that you can list on a monthly basis on Airbnb. And the Airbnb platform, although it first started out really catering towards those short-term rentals, those, 2 or 3 day stays, now Airbnb has evolved. And so when you go to book on Airbnb, one of the first things that they will ask you is, are you looking for a monthly stay or are you looking for a short stay? The nice thing about the Airbnb platform that makes it super easy is Airbnb handles all of the money collection for the host. So they collect the money for you, they distribute it out to you. Here in Denver, it's especially easy because not only does Airbnb handle the money collection for you, but they also handle the collection and the distribution of the required lodging tax on behalf of hosts as well. So as a host, you don't have to worry about handling or calculating any of those funds. Airbnb does all of that. The only thing that you have to do as a host in Denver specifically is file a lodging tax return once per year so that the city can kind of try to track where all of the funds are coming from. Airbnb was one of the first rental platforms out there to base the platform on social proof. So what that means is that I, as the host, review you as the guest, you as a guest review me as the host, and all of these reviews are public and attached to your Airbnb profile. The idea behind this is that if you know you're being reviewed, you'll behave yourself and actually, represent yourself appropriately. And then people can look at your reviews and see if they're comfortable hosting you or having you as a guest or vice versa. And so the social proof was a really big deal for Airbnb. It's something that really no other rental platform has ever done before. Uber kind of started it with the back and forth reviews of the drivers and the passengers. So Uber was the beginning. Airbnb added it to their platform. Over time, Airbnb has learned that social proof isn't enough to prevent risky bookings. So Airbnb now has a bunch of back end filters that prevent party houses or guests from misrepresenting themselves. And so they've added in, with so much data, basically extra layers of protections for hosts. And just checking the chat here, it doesn't look like we have any questions, but do feel free to pop those in. So just to give everybody an idea of how popular Airbnb is, we have 8,800 listings in the major metro areas. And the reason I focus on the metro areas is because this is really where Airbnb and short-term rentals are brand new. And this is where all of the action is. it's the metro areas that are really focusing on, you know, be, bringing in new regulations with relation to short-term rental because they're seeing more and more short-term rentals pop up. Now, as short-term rental has evolved, as sort of affordable housing has evolved, now we're also starting to see more regulation come to places that have always had short-term rentals. But that is not where all of the action is. It's mostly the growth for short-term rental is in the metro areas. And as you can see, most of that is in the Denver metro area. So one of the biggest questions that I always get is people are always asking me, well, how's the short-term rental market with all of this COVID-19 stuff that's happening? And what I can tell you is that COVID-19 has actually propelled the short-term rental industry forward. What we've seen is that hotels have been hit really hard, but because COVID-19 is something that spreads so easily, people are more apt to stay in a private space these days. So we've had a lot of people who maybe would have never otherwise tried to stay in an Airbnb switch to staying in Airbnbs exclusively. So it has been an up and down type of thing for the short-term rental industry with COVID-19. Of course, when shelter in place first started back in 2020, nobody knew what was happening. Nobody was allowed to travel. Bookings were hit very hard. But come a couple of months later, and everyone was tired of being in their homes, we saw bookings come back with a vengeance. We realized how quickly short-term rental reacts to supply and demand. If you're a short-term rental investor, you are not just in the rental industry or the real estate industry, you are part of the hospitality industry, you are part of the travel industry. So the market is affected by all of those factors as well. So, hit hard in the very beginning, but right back up to normal levels a few months later. And it was an extra boon for the hosts who had stayed in the market, because what happened was a lot of people in March and April of 2020 just dropped out of the market. They turned their rentals to long-term rentals, and they sold off their Airbnb properties. And then all of a sudden we saw an increase in demand for short-term rentals, and we had seen a reduction in supply. So the people who were in the market the summer of 2020 and the fall of 2020, we saw rates at 60% higher than what we'd seen in previous years. And of course, this summer, the rates have been extremely high as well, because now everyone's been getting vaccinated. And so people had been getting back to travel over the summertime as well. So it's just been a market that's been very reactive to the supply and demand. We're definitely seeing longer stays. We see that Wi-Fi is much more important than it used to be. A lot of people are traveling and working at the same time, which has been a big boost for the short-term rental industry as well. So we are getting a few questions. So let me take a look at this. When it comes to the options for the rental term, and with the realized delays in construction, how can agents leverage Airbnb to help our buyers find temporary housing? Hate to simply just send buyers out on their own. Would love to be able to use this as a value add to our services. Yes, so this is definitely something that we see a ton of. We get a lot of requests for bookings for people who are in the between houses. They purchased a home, it's not ready, they need to move out of their previous home. We also have just a lot of people moving to Denver and the Denver area. So we have a lot of need for very temporary housing. I think Airbnb is a great platform for that. My company, we do list a number of monthly rentals, monthly furnished rentals. We have a lot of 1 and 2 bedroom properties because those tend to be the most profitable as monthly rentals. If you have clients that are looking for larger properties, I always recommend, utilizing those resources and your network, like nextdoor.com, Facebook, Craigslist temporary housing is actually a great place to help find housing for your clients that are just in between houses. It's actually, it's truly a gap in the market, because this crazy low inventory real estate market has been low inventory for a while, but it's only getting, harder and harder to find housing, and we have more of a shortage. So I think there's, some opportunity opening up for furnished rentals that are larger, like 2 and 3 bedroom properties and things like that. So um, if you have rental properties, leverage your network to throw people into those properties, for a month or two at a time. The monthly rates are typically significantly higher than long-term rates because of the flexibility that comes with that. Question number 2, for hosts in a multi-unit high-rise, specifically the Windsor condos, how does a host counter angry residence owners from continually reporting the qualified Airbnb unit as an illegal unit? So, I think the best way to work with neighbors is to let them know that you're there, you understand their concerns, and that they should be reaching out to you if your guests are causing any issues. You, as the owner of that condo and the host, show them that you're a responsible host, that you don't want their peace to be disturbed. And that's the best thing you can do. Of course, I think there's always going to be some unreasonable people out there who just don't believe in short-term rental. They don't feel comfortable with it. And unfortunately, there's just not a whole lot you can do about that. But I'm kind of the, attract a fly with honey versus kind of fighting that or being resisting that. Make the most important thing you can do, and the best thing you can do, is make those people feel comfortable so that they feel better and they won't feel the need to report those units, especially if they're legal units. A client of mine has a primary residence unit and has a tax license approved from the city and continually audited due to neighbors reporting. Oh yeah, that's really unfortunate, Ryan. But yeah, like I said, the best thing he can do is reach out and try to make nice with those neighbors if he can. Are there any options for Airbnb management out there? Yes, there are definitely options for Airbnb management out there. We have a number of companies here in the Denver area. Definitely, if you need someone to manage your property, reach out to me. I myself do some management of property as well, but we are very niche to specifically Denver and to 1 and 2 bedroom properties. So, if you have a client that has that type of thing, we're a great fit for them. If they have a larger home or a single family home that maybe requires more oversight, then just reach out to me and I can make a referral for you. But there's definitely options for Airbnb management out there if you have clients that are looking for that. How will the condo tell product impact traditional short-term rental units? Yeah, so I think the condo tell is a really popular thing out there these days. Definitely, it's been up there in the mountain towns for quite some time. It certainly makes it easier for short-term rental owners, but it's just I think it's a matter of supply and demand. So the condo tell, as people build more and more of these, as this becomes more and more of an option, even in the cities, you have a higher supply of short-term rental units. So therefore, with a higher supply, that balances out with demand, and we tend to see the prices for short-term rental go down as we see more supply of short-term rental out there. And then I think it's also an opportunity for those wanting to get into the market that maybe don't necessarily want to pay for a full service manager or don't need the support of a full service manager. A condo tell is a great option if they're selling those units individually for someone who's looking to get into the market. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, Ryan mentioned that the neighbors are pissed and they hate the idea of short-term rental and report on a weekly basis. So unfortunately, maybe what your client might need to do is look at alternatives. Maybe it's time to sell that property or do something completely different. Yeah, that's definitely too bad. And I think we covered the chat. So nice job. I love all the questions. These are great questions. So I think these questions lead, pretty easily into our next slide. What we are seeing as a general trend is we're seeing a general trend of increasing regulation and enforcement with regards to short-term rentals. And what I like to make sure everybody really understands, especially when you're helping clients that are looking to purchase properties or invest in short-term rentals, is that the rules and regulation for short-term rentals, they are different city by city and county by county. And so really to understand what the possibilities are, it's really location specific for your clients. So making sure that they understand that it's important to do that due diligence and understand what areas are allowing short-term rentals and are more friendly to those short-term rentals. What we tend to see is that cities do tend to have some sort of a restriction on the number of short-term rentals out there. Most are requiring a registration process, most require lodging tax. And then you also need to take into consideration the HOA and the lease rules for any property. So, Lisa and I have heard some very sad stories about people who didn't realize that their HOA or their covenant community where they purchased a property wasn't going to allow them to short-term rent that property. In fact, it was another real estate agent who had called me, and he'd purchased a home in Highlands Ranch, and his big plan was to help pay that mortgage by short-term renting out the basement. And of course, Highlands Ranch is very strict with their covenants, and they just were not going to allow him to do that. In fact, it was even a barrier for him to long-term rent that basement unit because they're so particular about having just one household in a home over in that area. So, just things to be aware of and due diligence that needs to be done. I always recommend when you're helping a client invest in a short-term rental, the best place to find the short-term rental rules and regulations is to check the county and the city websites first, the .org or the .gov. If information isn't posted there, then go ahead and give a call to the excise and licensing departments and the zoning departments. These rules and regulations are just changing and evolving so quickly that if you try to Google for them and you look at news articles that come up and things like that, and even if you Google for them and you find the .gov or the .org website, you might find an older article or an older ordinance first before you find the new stuff. So it is hard to keep track of. It's just something where I recommend doing due diligence with each piece of property each time your client is looking to make a purchase, because these things are not stagnant and they're ever changing. So let me just look here. Do you see a statewide regulation that conforms all of the various city municipalities into rules or one guideline, or at least legislature that consolidates all of the rules? So far, we have not seen that with regards to short-term rentals. It's really been left up to the local municipalities to do that. Now, with accessory dwelling units, which is our other webinar that Lisa and I teach, which we do have one coming up tomorrow if anybody is interested. We'll send Amy those links so that you guys can see our upcoming webinars. We've seen a little bit of that with the accessory dwelling units. They've done it in California. They haven't done it in Colorado yet, but they're starting to do it neighborhood by neighborhood here in Denver, which is kind of fun. But no, we haven't seen that yet. With regards to short-term rental anywhere that I've heard of. So just a quick, we obviously can't hit every single city and what their rules and regulations are. But what we see most popular is we see a primary residence rule. That's what we have in Denver. What that means is that it needs to be your primary residence in order to be able to short-term rent that property. Now, what makes all of this super complicated is that the definition of primary residence is different city by city and county by county as well. So Denver has a very subjective definition of primary residence. They kind of look at multiple factors in your life to determine whether something is your primary residence. Most cities just say, if you are in the home 50% of the time, it is your primary residence. Now, a lot of people will ask, well, how in the world does the city know? I can tell you that they know because technology is really smart. And a lot of cities have implemented what is called compliance software, where they can know exactly how often your home is available, how often it's rented out. They can see your listing. They can see if you're renting out your home entire home, a basement unit that's missing an egress window, a bedroom, things like that. So it is really hard to slide under the radar with these rules and regulations. Longmont has done something interesting where you just have to be a resident of Longmont, but there's no more than one short-term rental on a block. Fort Collins has been extremely complicated. They have restrictions based on your particular property zone. So sometimes it has to be your primary residence. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just not allowed in Fort Collins. We don't see a lot of cities taking the route that Fort Collins has. But honestly, I don't think it's a bad way to go, because I think in commercial areas and things like that, people are more tolerant of short-term rentals, and they make more sense in areas like that. We have seen some cities who just have kind of kicked the short-term regulation down the road, kicked the can, so to speak. Really, Westminster had been seeking public feedback at one point in time, but they've since dropped that. So, and then we're now starting to see cities start to bring it up again, like Lakewood. Lakewood had put together a draft ordinance in 2019, and now Lakewood is looking at passing that draft ordinance on their short-term rental regulations. So, like I said, ever changing. City of Arvada has done something very unique, is they are allowing investors to purchase short-term rental properties. They allow up to 3 of them, but then what they do is they restrict short-term rentals, which means any rental less than 30 days at a time to 240 days out of the year. So the rest of the year, the 1/3 of the year, you have to rent the home out for 30 days or more at a time. So if you have investors, I've seen a lot of this, investors become very interested in Arvada, because Arvada has this, regulation where it is more investor friendly. Interest in Arvada, I think it's really important to sort of look at the math and the take-home income between a long-term and a short-term rental in Arvada. Because of that restriction to the 240 days out of the year, I'm almost certain that most of the time it'll be a wash between short-term and long-term in Arvada. Of course, it depends on the property. Thornton has allowed it on primary residence. North Glen is a little similar to Fort Collins, where it's restricted to certain areas. Littleton and Wheat Ridge both have permitted owners, have 2 types of permits, a non-owner occupied and an owner occupied short-term rental permit. Wheat Ridge has stated that starting, I think it's in October, they will limit the number of licenses, short-term rental licenses, to 2% of the housing stock out there. Right now in Denver, because of our primary residence rule, we have 1% of the housing stock out there. Littleton has not put out a lot of information about their 2 types of permits. So I'm watching Littleton very carefully to see what those rules and regulations are. Lisa, did you want to, well, here you are. This is your slide anyway, so you can pipe in about the secondary license here.
Okay, great. So, actually I'm so surprised, and so was Sabrina, about Littleton and Wheat Ridge, because the cities are typically following what Denver does. And ironically, a type 2 license was brought up very recently. It was proposed. The short-term rental advisory committee here for Denver was very interested in diving deeper into it, but it didn't pass city council. So I would not be surprised if this comes up again for Denver, in lieu of the fact that Littleton and Wheat Ridge are doing this. So that was very interesting for both Sabrina and I, who have been following these meetings for a very long time. And like I said, the last year and a half, I've actually been on the committee. So we'll see what happens and if that's brought up again. I would highly encourage you guys to attend these meetings. They're via Zoom. They're recorded, so you can get the recording too from them. They're not great about posting the recording, but you can attend, you can make public comment, and they're very interesting, actually. One thing that came up recently is platform accountability. Ryan, you asked about Airbnb management. So this was really, they wanted this for a very long time. And Airbnb got involved finally with the city of Denver. They are working together to ensure valid licenses. So you're going to be fined as a manager $1,000 for booking properties without a valid license. And Airbnb is checking that and watching that very, very closely. In fact, they will just automatically move your listing to a 30-day minimum. If you're looking at or have clients that are looking at properties in the mountains, we are seeing something that really is very unprecedented. That they are putting moratoriums in some cities in the mountains because they're requiring licenses now. For example, Grand Lake has 413 short-term rentals currently without a license. They want to get a handle on that because that is tax money for these little towns. And they need it. So they are limiting licenses. They're putting moratoriums in some mountain towns. They're getting much more strict in places that always had short-term rentals. So it's very strange. We never thought we would see it happen, but it is happening. So if you're interested in mountain towns or you have clients that are, I would get on that immediately because it is ever evolving and changing. And the problem is simply that the workforce is suffering. They can't find housing. So these small towns are desperate for employees and they're short-staffed everywhere because nobody wants to drive that drive. So that is really the reason why these mountain towns are really cracking down on short-term rentals. As you can imagine, it's a sore spot absolutely for the locals. Are you okay? A couple questions here. For me, I think for Summit County, is there still a mandate that an owner or STR management company is located within the county? Yes, that's another thing they're doing, Ryan. Thank you for bringing that up. Grand County, I know for sure they have to be an hour away. And yeah, a lot of mountain towns are also going to that the company or somebody needs to be located within the county. Thanks for that, Ryan. Are you all doing in-person trainings with this class? We are not. We are we're keeping it via Zoom. All right. So Denver is working with the zoning department now to do on-site inspections at license renewal on a case-by-case basis. That has caused some issues, as you can imagine, but what excise and licensing is saying is that we are on the hook if we give a license to somebody who is renting out something that is unsafe. So, you know, really make sure that you're doing it right the first time and you don't get caught on renewal and you can't have your license renewed because the home is not safe for people to stay in it. This is going to be super interesting, you guys. By 2023, long-term rentals will also require inspections and a license. That's going to be interesting to see what happens with our market when that occurs. Lodgers tax revenue, you know, it's not a wonder that these small towns are interested in this kind of money. Denver made 10.6 million in lodgers tax in 2019, 5.6 in 2020 because of the pandemic, but we're already up to 4.9 as of August for 2021. So like we said before, what Sabrina said before is the short-term rental has bounced and is doing very, very well after COVID. Unfortunately, the hotels are still suffering, but you know, these mountain towns, they want that revenue. And that is why they are starting to regulate and require licensing. So is that
and just to mention a little bit about this, you know, these inspections, zoning inspections at renewal. So what's happening is this is happening here in Denver. What's happening is the excise and licensing department is working directly with the zoning department. When you go to renew your license, they're looking through your listing. If you're rented out 100% of the time, or, you know, 90% of the time or whatever, they are looking to see if you have a secondary unit, like a mother-in-law unit or a carriage house. If you do, then they're looking at that listing, and they're looking for building violations. They're making sure that you're actually permitted for that use. And they're looking to make sure you're zoned for that use. And they've done it a couple of ways. I had one client who totally went out of his way to make sure he was doing everything on the up and up when he first applied for his short-term rental license. And they sent an inspector over unannounced to take a look at his unit. He has an up-down duplex. And what City of Denver has made very clear now is that even if your duplex is on the same deed, that each side of the duplex or each level of the duplex is considered its own primary residence, and his property is zoned, or it's not, no, it was permitted as multi-use. So they are telling him he's no longer able to short-term rent that other unit that he's been doing it, and that he specifically like reached out to the City of Denver to get permission to do. So things are ever changing. You know, I had another client who had a basement unit, and you know, they scheduled an inspection with her, and they're requiring her to get a permit for her second kitchen, which is not a big deal at all. What they're doing is they're being very kind about it. They're allowing her to continue to short-term rent and give her her short-term rental license while she goes through that permitting process. So it is something to really do due diligence about if your clients are looking to have a secondary unit or a, you know, an equal unit that they're trying to rent out short term. It really has to be on the up and up. And just because something has been around forever does not mean it's on the up and up. You know, we've had clients who've had basement units for, you know, since the 1940s, and City of Denver is calling them out and telling them they're not allowed to have them. So something to be very aware of. And it's coming with the long-term rentals too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a long-term rental in our neighborhood right behind us. There's no way she's going to pass an inspection. And so I'm just waiting to see what happens with that house in 2023. I mean, it's falling apart at the seams, literally. I had on social media last week, there was a real estate agent who was selling a duplex, 2 units, and he was touting it as you can live in one and rent out, you know, short-term rent out the other. You have to be so careful of that. I mean, obviously he has not taken our class, and that's old news now. You cannot do that. And so again, it's who are they going to blame when they purchase something and are thinking about using it in one way and it's not allowed? They're going to be angry at the agent, right? So that's a huge reason why Sabrina and I teach this class, is we want to avoid those kinds of things from happening.
Yeah. And then we have a great comment here. I just did a quick search in Highlands Ranch and it shows about a dozen listings. Yeah, I think that's totally common. There's always people out there who have listings that maybe aren't allowed, or you know, whether it's legal in Highlands Ranch or not, people are always going to try to do it. I think the thing to keep in mind is that this is, if you're doing something and it's not on the up and up, your income is at risk, because once you get caught, your income's not there. And you've invested a ton of money in furnishing that property, making it nice, that sort of thing. So yeah, there's lots of people who do short-term rentals without the permits, you know, without the license, behind sort of closed doors, hoping that nobody will notice. And maybe no one will notice for a while, but maybe someone will notice in a couple of weeks. It just depends on how that goes. So I think whether or not people want to do short-term rentals without, you know, having the proper license or disclosing it to their HOAs and their covenant communities the way that is typically required is really dependent upon that person's own risk tolerance. And we saw that here in Denver too. You know, of course, when the primary residence came out in 2017, I would say that 80% of listings in Denver were not primary residences. That, of course, has since come into compliance because Denver's been so good at enforcing that. I see that Ryan has raised his hand. Did you want to say something, Ryan?
No, that was by accident.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, if anyone does want to say something, feel free though to raise your hand, and we'll let you have a chance. We always love, the input from others in the class. Okay, let me see if I can get back to the presentation. Here we go. And then this back to Lisa.
Yep, back to me. So ADU is definitely a huge conversation right now too with short-term rental advisory committee. They are addressing rules and regulations with regards to Airbnb and accessory dwelling units. So we have a main house, and then we're building an accessory dwelling unit in our backyard. So if we stay here in our main house, we can short-term rent the accessory dwelling unit. But if we decide to downsize, which is an option, to our accessory dwelling unit, we cannot short-term rent our main house. It would have to be a long-term rent. So that is currently the rules and regulations around an ADU and short-term renting. And again, that can change at any time. For example, right now, the rule is that you cannot sell one of the properties, the primary residence or the ADU. That could change as well. I mean, we're sort of hopeful for that. If we decide to live in the ADU, it would be cool if we could sell our main house, right? Or vice versa. But right now, those are against the rules. So the host must live in the main residence, not the ADU, to short-term rent it. Investors can live in the ADU and long-term rent the main house, but no short-term renting is allowed. Is that clear as mud?
Yeah.
And to be very specific, those are the rules in Denver.
Right, correct.
So the rules with regards to like carriage houses and accessory dwelling units are different city by city and county by county. Even whether or not you can have one, of course, is different lot by lot. But in Boulder, for example, some accessory dwelling units have been grandfathered in with short-term rental licenses, but they've updated the zoning codes for accessory dwelling units, where now people are able to build bigger ones. But any of the new accessory dwelling units built in Boulder are not allowed to be short-term rentals. I got very lucky with my current situation. I kind of have the opposite situation of what Lisa has. Is I purchased my home, and I was lucky enough to have an accessory dwelling unit on the back of the home. I have a little carriage house on the back of my home. It was completely zoned. My house was zoned for it. It was permitted. Everything was on the up and up. I have a letter from the city stating there's a bit of a zoning variance that we received because the house takes up more of the lot than it typically should be allowed to. I have a letter from the city with that zoning variance. So we've been like super lucky. My carriage house has been there since the 1930s, and no one has ever questioned whether or not we're allowed to have that carriage house and whether or not we're allowed to short-term rent. Because in Denver, for whatever reason, even though they're not being friendly to the duplexes, has been very clear that an accessory unit, whether it be a basement unit or a little carriage house on the back, is part of your primary residence, and you are allowed to short-term rent it. So that's been wonderful.
Yeah, we're finding that ADUs are, they're very favorable to cities, especially rural, because it just makes sense. Ryan, your question about 30 days or 60 for long-term, it's 30.
Yeah, so as long as you are renting something out for 30 days or more, you're not subject to any of the rules and regulations for short-term rentals. And
that's currently a license, but by 2023, you're going to need a license.
Correct. Yeah, you don't need a license for it at the current time. Now that is one consistency that is pretty widespread. The definition of short-term rental is less than 30 days. And what you'll find, you've probably noticed already throughout the class, Lisa and I will use the term Airbnb and short-term rental a little bit interchangeably, because Airbnb is sort of the Kleenex of short-term rental, if you will.
Kelly had a question here. Let me look. We don't, she's asking if we work with HOAs to help craft short-term guidance rules. We don't, but what we are finding is they really are not friendly and are very opposed to any kind of short-term rentals. And if you start doing it and they catch you, they're gonna make a rule if there isn't already a rule made, right, Sabrina?
Yeah, that's what we found. And then Kelly had a good comment too. She's seen some HOAs define long-term at 6 months. So what HOAs, so the HOA is different than, of course, what the city regulations are. And so we've seen most HOAs put in a minimum lease term. And that minimum lease term is typically, no shorter than 30 days. We often see 3 months or 6 months is very common as well. So when you're helping clients purchase short-term rental investments, looking at those HOAs is extremely important. And what I found, I offer a buyer consultancy service where we really help buyers narrow down the best short-term rental. I work side by side with real estate agents to do this. Is what we found is in the cities where it's more friendly to short-term rental, the properties that would be the most lucrative as short-term rentals usually have a barrier with regards to what the HOA or the covenant is allowing people to do. So it is difficult to pinpoint those best properties, or there's not many out there that are great short-term rentals that are non-primary residence properties anymore. And that may change over time. So it's something to keep watching without a doubt. Ryan says, I've had success with HOAs approving STR, however, with a rental fee of 20 to 25 to 75 per application. So essentially it becomes a pass-through cost. And this was an Aurora. That's great feedback, Ryan.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we have
Ryan,
you
you
talk
should
about
teach a
that?
class on that.
Yeah, seriously.
Tell us more.
Am I live here?
You're live.
live.
We can hear
Yeah,
you.
so
We
this
can see
was
you
a few
too.
years ago in the Timbers condos out by Buckley Air Force Base. We had an airman who was going to be leaving to Colorado Springs but wanted to short-term rent his unit in his building. And we got the HOA to approve the short-term rentals. But the rule was that any renter had to fill out an application, and that application had to be approved by the board or by the HOA, and it had to come with that one has a $25 application fee. They later raised that to $75. So every time he rented the place out, it was just an added cost, like a cleaning cost, added to the fees that the renters chose. And they paid the $25 and then $75 every time they rented. And that's what got them around to approve this complex's short-term rental policy.
That's very cool.
It was pretty cool.
I think that's a great, it's sort of a great win-win solution, because all of those extra $25 per stay, your average stay is 3.5 days. So you're often looking at 75 to 100 stays in a year.
Every 2 to 3 days.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
What we know about HOAs is they like money. So, they like money a lot more than they like, not having money. So that was the solution that we came up with for him. I actually don't know if they're still doing that, because this was a few years ago that this happened. And it was really early on when Airbnb was starting to come out, but I would assume that they are.
Very
I'll have
cool.
to look it up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to do it. And then the HOA has all of that extra money to upkeep the building, so it benefits even the people that aren't renting their homes out short term. Now we have another question here. I've started working with a multifamily syndication group. Do you know of any multifamily units in our area? I'm assuming you're asking that allow for short-term rents. Ryan had, I think, put the question out about the Windsor. That's a big one that does allow it. I think there are a few others out there, and these things, it's really hard to find, and it changes all the time, and there's no quick way to find this information. Certainly there are corporate owned buildings that they work directly with renters and allow them to short-term rent their property or their rental, their rental units here in Denver. A couple of the nice high-end buildings over by Union Station are allowing renters to do that. And then the building takes quite a nice fee for allowing them to do that. So there's lots of different ways to work that situation.
One thing too that I'll mention that we haven't yet is right now, and I'm just saying right this minute, Denver is allowing long-term renters to short-term rent. Does that make sense? But I am telling you, I'm just waiting for that to change here in Denver.
Are you saying sublease is what they're allowing them?
Correct. They need to get
Oh, whoa.
permission from the owner, but that is currently allowed in Denver.
Yeah, so basically what it is the renter is the primary residence on that property.
Yeah.
They obtain the short-term rental license. In order to obtain that short-term rental license, they have to prove they have permission from the landlord in order to do that.
And then some landlords are then working out some sort of a fee then, so that everybody is making money.
But can you just explain that one more time?
So you are a landlord, you're long-term renting out your home. The person who is renting out your home on a long-term basis can get a short-term rental license and short-term rent out the house.
Oh, so the tenant becomes the host.
Correct.
The tenant
Whoa.
is the primary residence who applies for that short-term rental license.
Yeah.
Because the rule is it has to be your primary residence in Denver in order to short-term rent. So,
Yeah.
if a renter lives there full-time, they're a primary residence. They just don't
Right.
own the property.
Whoa. That's
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
almost like what you used to see.
what, Kelly? Say that again.
Is that because of all the forbearance stuff that they're looking at doing that?
No, they've been doing that forever.
Is that because of all the forbearance stuff that was going on and they want to make sure that? I know in college towns, they used to do that all the time because my roommates and I in college would always,
Yeah.
not want to get penalized for breaking our lease. So we'd find somebody to sublease all the time.
Yeah, no, the allowing of a renter to be the primary resident has been there since Denver made the short-term rental rules and regulations. So it's not a result of, the forbearance or anything related to the COVID-19 market at all.
Yeah. And don't get too excited about it, because as a member of the short-term rental advisory committee, I can say that I'm absolutely shocked that Denver is still allowing that, but they are currently, like I said, of this minute. I think as a landlord, there are so many risks involved in that, but
right.
I'm not sure that's the smartest way to go. But you have to really, really trust your renter on that one, and trust that their due diligence, and there's a lot of insurance. It's a mess insurance wise, but it can be done. Okay, so speaking of insurance, I think what people do not realize is that anytime you are changing the use of your home, you must notify your insurer. And the reason for this is that if there's a claim, an insurance company can deny that claim because they were not aware of the usage for the home. People don't understand that there are several policies, several totally different policies for the different uses of your home. Denver's application requires confirmation that you have notified your homeowner's insurer. And I think just that notification is reminding people, oh yeah, because they didn't even think of that. Denver requires that hosts have at least 1 million in liability protection, and Airbnb's protection policy meets this requirement. A lot of cities are going to the application confirmation piece, and I think that that's taking care of all the problems we had before when people just didn't think about it. Any questions on that? Some class testimonials. I can't take all the credit, Lisa. You put on a great class. This was the most amazing workshop I have ever been to. Thank you so much. Very informative and useful, very knowledgeable instructors. We always love getting these testimonials for our work, huh, Sabrina?
We do. And, Lisa is such a great resource. She's our resident ADU expert. So definitely reach out to Lisa regarding any questions on accessory dwelling units. And then Lisa, maybe we should have you type your link into the chat so that people can reach out.
Sure.
And just make sure you've got everyone on there so that it goes.
Yep. I'm going to do my email address, and then I can send you all the information if you just email me. And hopefully some of you guys will come to our class tomorrow, and we do them every month. So, and this company ADU for you is just incredible. I mean, I was so impressed with them and what they've done for us that I went to work for them. So it doesn't get better than that, right?
Yes, so Lisa's the expert there, and we will send up the ADU classes at the same time tomorrow. It's from 11 to 1.
And the cool thing is that ADU for you comes, somebody from the company is on the call, and so you are going to get like more information than you ever wanted to know about accessory dwelling units.
Yes, so we always send a follow-up email after this class with links to our classes. And if I get a chance, I'll try to throw in the link to our class schedule as well.
Yeah, Ryan, you'll get to do another one for sure. We do it
definitely
a month at least.
All right, so just going back to Airbnb real fast. So one of the things I do want to just sort of mention is Denver's. We've talked about these different definitions of primary residence and how in most cities in the Denver metro area, it's required that the home is your primary residence in order to rent it out. Now, Denver made a very subjective definition. Basically, they're looking at all of these different factors to determine whether or not your home is your primary residence. So the first thing Denver is doing is they're looking at your records. They're looking at all of your properties that you own, all of your legal addresses, all of your billing addresses, all of your voting, where you're registered to vote, your driver's license, your car registration, where your kid goes to school. They're looking at all of this stuff to verify whether or not the home is your primary residence. If they see you own multiple properties, they're verifying that these other properties are in fact long-term rentals and not your primary residence and not a short-term rental, because you can only have one short-term rental in Denver. So they're looking at all of that. And then the things that they're looking at renewal is they're looking at things like how often are you staying in the home and how often is it rented out? And if it's rented out more than 50% of the time, they're questioning why. Why aren't you in your own house 50% of the time? Do you travel for work? If you travel for work, what is your source of income? If you're employed, where is your corporate office located? So they're really sort of delving very deep into your lifestyle to try to figure out subjectively whether or not your home is in fact your primary residence. And if they have any question as to whether or not your home is your primary residence, what they will do is they will send you a legal affidavit to sign whether or not that property is, you claim that as your primary residence. But because the definition is so incredibly subjective, a lot of people aren't comfortable signing that legal affidavit. Plus, Denver had a history in 2019. They did charge people with felonies in relation to signing this primary residence affidavit. So people were very scared to sign this affidavit for a little while. Now we're seeing more people become more comfortable with signing this affidavit. Number one, because memories, I think, are short. People, the impact of that is lessening. The felony charges were all dropped. Nobody was actually charged with a felony and went to jail for this. So that's the way it works in Denver. And this is so subjective, and hosts, a lot of people don't feel comfortable with it, but Denver, I think, did it to try to be more friendly to short-term rental. Originally, Denver wanted to do the 50% rule where you had to be in your home half the time. But Denver, because Denver does a short-term rental advisory committee meeting monthly where they get feedback from people, a lot of people gave feedback that, you know, they didn't feel the 50% rule was fair. And so this is what Denver came up with as a compromise, which I think that it had all good intentions, you know, this sort of subjective definition of primary residence, but it is very, it's just subjective is what it comes down to. And then licensing restrictions. We have spoken about this a little bit. Duplexes, you can't live in one side and short-term rent the other. You have to short-term rent the side that you live in, and the other side has to be a long-term rental or somebody else's, under someone else's ownership.
Why is that?
It's a good question, and I don't understand exactly why Denver has done that, because why are they allowing a basement unit to be a
Right.
short-term rental, or an access or a carriage house to be a short-term rental? You know, I never live in my carriage house, but just because it's smaller than my main house, it's considered part of my primary residence. So I'm allowed to short-term rent it. So I don't get it. I don't know why they.
I mean,
why they
yeah, I
made
mean,
that
if you own
determination.
the whole building,
Yeah,
yeah,
I agree. And it's the same thing with like multi-unit, like a residential fourplex or something like that. You cannot live in one of the units and short-term rent another unit. You have to short-term rent the unit that you live in. So they've just, you know, I think that's a way of regulating the number of short-term rentals out there, which I think is really the main goal. You know, if we have investors buying up fourplexes and, you know, duplexes and all of these properties and short-term renting everything that they can, that really does in some way reduce the housing supply for the long-term residents in the area. And we already have a shortage of the housing supply. So, you know, that's the purpose of regulating how many short-term rentals they are. And the way that they do it is, you know, like this, you know, it's got to be your primary residence.
right.
So I think we did already talk about the accessory units need to be up to building and zoning codes. The other thing to keep in mind is it's one short-term rental license per household per deed. So this is something to keep in mind when you're doing your sales transactions. Is I always recommend having the seller disclose upfront, have they ever short-term rent the property? Have they ever had a license? Have they ever had a listing? If they have them surrender their license and have them deactivate their listing completely. So I'll give you the example of my home. I have a short-term rental license on my home because I rent out my carriage house. If I were to sell my home and my buyer wants to short-term rent the carriage house, but I forgot to surrender my short-term rental license, they would go to apply for a short-term rental license and they would be denied because there's already a license on my deed. On the other side of that, my buyer doesn't want to short-term rent the carriage house. They want to use it for their own purposes. I still have a listing hanging out somewhere on the internet, even though there's no available days. My short-term rental license expires. I of course don't renew because I don't own the property anymore. And then that buyer receives a violation for having a short-term rental with an expired license. So it's not, you know, nothing that can't be fixed, but it is just an extra piece of the puzzle where something could go not so smoothly. And if it doesn't go smoothly, they look to their real estate agent. And so it's just one way for you to be the hero even more than you're the hero already finding them a home. Let me just double check here. Whoops. Sorry, this is the Zoom. I feel like the Zoom menu bar is always in my way. So yes, I think we did cover everything in that slide there. The other thing to keep in mind, and I think this is obvious based on what we've spoken about, but you can only have one part of your property short-term rented at a time. So for example, I can't go on vacation and short-term rent both my main home and my carriage house at the same time. Either one, only one of them can be rented at the same time. So if I'm renting out my main home short-term, my carriage house has to be either empty or rented out long-term, and vice versa. So something to be aware of for people who are maybe looking to utilize, like say my husband and I traveled 6 months out of the year, we wouldn't be able to use both of the units as short-term rentals all the time. All right, so just a quick case study on my own home. One of the reasons people are so interested in short-term rental, I think, is because a lot of times the numbers look really awesome for people. And I can tell you that having a short-term rental on your primary residence is typically a lucrative way to go. Now, each property is unique. Each property is different. It's dependent upon the location, of course. In my case, I live in the West Wash Park neighborhood, so it's a very desirable neighborhood for travelers as well as even for long-term renters. My carriage house is completely remodeled, little 450 square foot carriage house, completely separate from my home. It's 1 bedroom, 1 bath. We have a parking permit that we provide to people to park in front of the house as well. So if I were to long-term rent that home, I'm renting that home out for, maybe $1,300 to $1,400 a month. I'm taking home about $15,000 to $16,000 annually. If I midterm rent, which is that monthly furnished rental, 30-day minimum, I'm renting that home out between $18,000 and $2,000 a month, maybe sometimes in the summer times, $2,200 a month. At that point in time, it's very common. It's a furnished rental. I'm paying for all of the utilities and the internet. My take home on that is, anywhere between $19,000 and $22,000 annually. As a short-term rental, which is what I do, my average stay is about 3.5 days. And I rent that property out, net of the cleaning expenses, the supplies. I'm netting about $30,000 a year on that short-term rental. So when you compare it to the long-term rental, the take-home income is super lucrative. The reason it's so lucrative compared to the long-term is because it is in fact my primary residence. So if I were an investor on the property, I would have a lot of additional costs. But because I live here, I already maintain the home. I already make sure the lawn is mowed. I already make sure the snow is removed. I already have cable. I already have internet. I already pay utilities on the home. None of these costs are really extraneous costs to me. I'd be paying for these things whether or not I rent out the home or not. Either I'd be using it for myself or I wouldn't. So, a lot of the costs that I would have that would be extra as an investor are not extra for me as a primary resident on my home. So that's why I think having a short-term rental on a primary residence is so incredibly lucrative. Now, when you're looking at clients who are looking to invest in a short-term rental, they want to be more of a hands-off type investor, the numbers start to look very different. And what we tend to see in general is that your take-home income on a short-term rental property is about 50% of what your estimated top line revenue is, as a general rule. And it depends on where you're located. So the two biggest costs that we see are the cost to clean the property and the cost of management. And then of course you have all of the upkeep and things like that. But this is all very back of the napkin math here. But even just looking at the cleaning and the management fees. So for example, you have a property, the estimated revenue on that is $50,000 annually. Anywhere you look at the estimated revenue on a short-term rental, it includes the cleaning fees that you collect from the guest, because these platforms, when they pay you, they don't really distinguish what you're being paid for. They just pay you sort of the lump sum of the booking fee and the cleaning fee and any other fees that you're charging the tenant. So your top line revenue is $50,000, but that $50,000 includes all of the cleaning fees you collect from the guest. Well, if your average stay is 3.5 days. You could very easily have 100 stays over the course of a year. You charge the guest $100 per clean. You pay your cleaner $100 per clean. You do the math on that. That's $10,000 of your revenue that is straight in and out for cleaning costs. So that's 20% of your revenue right there. And then managers, short-term rental managers, they typically charge anywhere between 25 and 55% for the management. It depends on where you're located. 25 is common in the city, 35 to 55 is kind of common in the resort towns. The reason that that management fee is so high, compared to long-term rental, which is typically 8 to 12%, is that it's a really active process to manage your short-term rental. And this is something that you should let your clients know about. You're in the hospitality business. You are communicating with tenants 24/7. You're dealing with marketing and bookings 24/7. You're dealing with dynamic pricing. Short-term rentals work like hotels. Your price should be different every single day, depending on your supply and demand, if you're going to maximize your revenue. A lot of people don't do that. They think they're doing fine, but there's a lot more potential out there. You have a turn on that property every 3.5 days, and you're dealing with linens and towels and things like that. So managers charge for the extra active management that's required with a short-term rental. So that's why it's the 25 to 55%. So if you're looking at that $50,000 at 25%, that's 12.5. You start doing the math, you're taking home about $24,000 on that $50,000 annual revenue. If you're in the mountains and you're paying a management fee of 35 to 55%, you're taking home, anywhere between 25 and 35% of your top line revenue. So it's something that your investors really need to be aware of, is that these numbers on short-term rentals, they tend to look so good top line, and it's hard to believe how quickly they get whittled down sometimes. So it's just something you want to help educate your clients on. We have a couple of comments here. So Lisa was mentioning taxes. So taxes, there's a couple of different other taxes you need to be aware of, and it really depends on where you're located and how Airbnb and Vrbo are allowing you to collect those taxes. So of course you have lodging tax, which you should be able to collect from the guest directly and then pay to your city. So the lodging tax really should not be an impact to you. Of course you have income tax on any income that you earn. And so the way that you're taxed on that income is really dependent on your personal situation, what's best for you, and what you and your CPA have worked out. I haven't included taxes in any of my calculations because that's all very specific to the person. And no matter what, everyone pays taxes on either a long-term or a short-term rental. Our short-term rental for my personal, on my personal properties, we put those as Schedule E. We expense out as a percentage of the size of our property, the utilities, and the upkeep of the property and things like that. So that's the way that my family does it personally. That's what my CPA has advised for us. But of course, that's something that's up to each person's personal situation. Ryan says, we have a few clients who have units in the Windsor. One has a smaller 1,080 square foot, 2-bedroom. His STR is $84,000 net. That is awesome. That location for the Windsor is really great for a short-term rental, and a 2-bedroom, 2-bath is also really great. Because of the primary residence rule in Denver, most of the short-term rentals out there are small. There's a lot of times they're what I have. They're a basement unit or an accessory dwelling unit or a bedroom. And so 2-bedroom, 2-bath is something that it's not as common as the smaller properties. If you've got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath or something like that, those rent out for a significant amount of money as well, just because the supply of these larger properties is so incredibly small because of the primary residence rule. The other with the larger 1,900 square foot 2-bed nets $145,000. So that's awesome. Those are wonderful numbers. 2020 was clearly not in line. Yeah, so that makes sense. I think we all affected, 2020 was affected, different hosts differently, with most of our clients that we worked with, we really work with a pricing and a marketing strategy. So we were lucky enough to keep our clients occupied. Most of our clients had 2020 equivalent to 2019 for us. So we were very lucky. And I think that's some of the benefit to, really understanding how to work the Airbnb marketing and the algorithms and the pricing and things like that. And then Ryan says monthly long-term rent would be $42,000 annually and $55,000 respectively. So these people are making like double, triple. So that's really great, great information, Ryan. Thank you. So a little bit about myself and bnbExcellent. I've mentioned it a little bit. We do work directly with real estate agents. We work side by side with real estate agents, really to be a resource to you and to help your clients understand what they're getting into so that you can close more transactions. So we have different services that we offer. We offer decision-making support. We can help consult with you and your buyer directly so that your buyer can get pointed in the right direction, or they can just essentially pick our brains and really understand what they're getting into with their short-term rental purchase so that they can feel comfortable actually pulling the trigger on that purchase. And then we also offer post-purchase support. So we help clients, we help teach clients how to be really successful with those short-term rentals and really maximize those revenues. And what we found is that as clients realize how well they can do with their short-term rental investments, it really does build up more transactions for you. I have one client who, he came to me probably, no, it's been a little bit longer than 6 months, but he's continues to purchase properties. But he came to me, he wanted to short-term rent one of the properties he already owned. I explained to him that he couldn't short-term rent it, but it would make a great 30-day rental. Even his attorney didn't realize that he wasn't allowed to short-term rent the property. And I had to send over the actual language so that they understood. And he's a very up and up client, so he didn't want to try to like slide under the radar or anything like that. And we don't work with clients that do that anyway. But anyway, we did so well on that first 30-day rental that he's since added 6 more units. He's looking at purchasing an entire building. So the great benefit and the way that we work so well with real estate agents synergistically is that we really work with your clients to make them feel comfortable. A lot of times when clients are looking to buy or sell, they come to us first to sort of try to understand what they're getting into and run those numbers. So we're able to keep your leads warm for you. And at that point in time, we get to refer them right back to you. So after this class, we'll send out a follow-up email. Lisa and I will have our contact information there. One of the, I think, most popular services that I offer is an expert Q&A session. It's 45 minutes one-on-one with either just your client or you and your client to really answer all of those questions for you guys. So just be on the lookout for that. I'm here to be a resource for you. And of course, the follow-up email includes a bunch of resources as well, links to things we've talked about in this class. And I believe Amy is going to send out also the recording for you guys. So you guys are always welcome to reach out. Here's just a quick example of what a big impact working with an expert can make. We had a client who had a basement unit for a couple of years before she found us. She actually found us through a referral. She is a real estate agent. So, she felt pretty adept in the world of real estate and rentals and pricing and things like that. And she thought she was doing fine until she started talking to her buddy. And once she brought us on and we helped to implement our pricing strategies and our marketing strategies and really start to work those Airbnb algorithms for her income, as you can see in that first chart, just increased significantly. We were able to get her an extra $12,000 over the course of the year compared to the previous year on just a tiny little basement unit. So imagine, had she been doing this the entire time, she's left tens of thousands on the table. And imagine if it was a much larger unit, like a nice home up in the mountains or something along those lines, the impact could easily be hundreds of thousands of dollars in just marketing and learning to really manage that property effortlessly. And that's what we help clients do. And that's the impact that I love to see. So a couple of pros and cons, just to kind of summarize short-term rentals. So pros, very clear. It can be very lucrative. You don't have to worry about rent collection or late rents. I think the attitude between a short-term renter and a long-term renter is very different. The short-term renters to me are just a lot more fun. I love working with them and interacting with them. It's more of there's a lot more positive interaction. Whereas with a long-term renter, you're really, even if you have a great relationship with them, most of your interaction is when something's gone wrong or when they're providing you their initial inspection of the property and they're telling you, all of the things they shouldn't be charged for in their security deposit. So it's a really pleasant interaction with the short-term rentals. One of the things that I really fell in love with is with my little carriage house. It looks brand new. We remodeled that 6 years ago. And I often have people who are so surprised that I remodeled it that long ago, because it's been upkept very well, because it's clean top to bottom every 3.5 days. And then we're also able to get in and maintain the property really frequently and do the little touch up on the wall, or fix that loose doorknob. So it stays really nice. And I really do love that about the short-term rental. With long-term rental, you just can't be that hands-on, because you would be disrupting your tenants if you're maintaining that property so much. And of course, when you live someplace long-term, you probably don't get it cleaned from top to bottom every 3.5 days. So that's what I love about short-term rental. The definite cons, very time intensive. You are in the hospitality business. And that's why managers charge so much, of course. There's some risk to it. You don't have tenant screening the way that you have tenant screening with a long-term rental. That's something we didn't talk about very much. One of the things that I see a lot of people misunderstand about short-term rental is that the renters who rent your place for 2 to 3 days at a time, they don't have any tenant rights. But I can definitely tell you that if a tenant overstays or will not leave your Airbnb, you're still going through that eviction process. The police will tell you that it's a civil case, and the way that you get them out of that property is through the eviction process. So, that is an extra risk with short-term rental. People do have a certain amount of rights because you've let them onto that property. You can't report them for trespassing, and if you try, the police won't consider it trespassing. It's considered a civil case. So please, make sure your clients understand that. And then, I think the biggest risk is the changing rules and regulations. The rug can really be pulled out from under you very quickly, and they don't often grandfather people in. So say Denver decides I can't, you're not allowed to short-term rent a carriage house. Well, there goes my income. I go back to 30-day rentals or long-term rentals. So something to be aware of. Your clients kind of need to have the stomach for the ups and downs of short-term rental. You don't get a guaranteed income every single month. It is very seasonal. And there's more risk involved. It's kind of the way it works. Higher risk, higher return with regards to short-term rentals. All right, so we're looking pretty good. I don't see any questions in the chat. I am going to turn this back over to Lisa.
Thanks you guys so much for joining us today. It was fun to have a small group, and it was more interactive, and we always love that. So Amy, thank you for having us. Great to see you. Here's our contact information. If you guys need anything, we would love for you to join us on our ADU class. And I teach a personal branding class too. That's really, really fun. So you can find our class schedule on either one of our websites. It looks like a gorgeous day. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Kathy. Thanks, everybody.